Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Donia Human Rights Center's annual Martin Luther King Jr. lecture. I'm Monica Hakimi. I'm a professor at the law school, and it's my real honor to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Ambassador Susan Page, who is a professor from practice both at the law school and at the Ford Policy School here at the University of Michigan. She was the first U.S. ambassador to the Republic of South Sudan, where she played a crucial role in navigating the instability and eventual eruption of civil war in the country and providing foreign policy options for change. She then went on to serve as charge d'affaires to the U.S. mission to the African Union, acting permanent representative to the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. She also played a key role in the multi-U.S. government agency Security Governance Initiative for Ghana in 2016. And she has had a long list of experiences working for the US government in various capacities, as well as more recently for the United Nations. Her talk today is about race and US foreign policy, and I think we're all in for a treat. Our protocol is going to be pretty standard. We'll give Ambassador Page some time for her remarks, and after her remarks, I'll be taking questions in the chat function, so feel free to submit your questions. I will ask them on your behalf. I don't think I will get to all of them, but I hope to get to a good many of them and to have a really great conversation here this evening. So with that, I am going to turn off my video and hand over the reins to Ambassador Page. Ambassador, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Monica, for that very warm introduction. So let me take a moment to thank the organizers of today's event, in particular, the Donia Human Rights Center's director and my colleague and friend, Steve Ratner, as well as all of the many co-sponsors of this afternoon's lecture, namely the African Studies Center, the Department of Afro-American and African Studies, the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy's International Policy Center and Weiser Diplomacy Center, and the University of Michigan Law School. Finally, my special thanks to the many people working behind the scenes, from those who put together the program, the media professionals, the IT experts, and of course, to everyone who cleans up the messes that we leave behind. Your collective work is greatly appreciated. Now, welcome to all of you for your online or phone presence today. I feel a little bit like an airline person. I know that you have many choices of webinars to tune into these days, so I appreciate that you selected this one. Seriously, I am very honored to present this year's Donia Human Rights Center's Martin Luther King Jr. lecture on U.S. race relations and foreign policy. In 1998, then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright stated that one of her most important jobs is to call attention to the dangers that still confront us, and to the direct connection that exists between the success or failure of our foreign policy and the day-to-day lives of the American people. If Madam Secretary's foreign policy prescription is disarmingly straightforward, the day-to-day lives of the American people, their interaction with foreign policy, have been anything but straightforward. Riot insurrection at the US Capitol on January 6th, perpetrated largely by a group of far-right white extremists, came as a shock to many people. Afterwards, we heard over and over again by both Democrats and Republicans alike, phrases such as, "This violence, this storming of the Capitol, this is not who we are as a nation," or "This does not represent who we are," or even, "These scenes are reserved for a banana republic, and we are better than this." But for many Black people, the violence and destruction caused by the rioters on January 6th and their attempt to overturn a free and fair election by force at the seat of the government while the vote certification was actually occurring, while certainly terrible to see unfold before our eyes on live television, it did not come as a complete surprise. To be clear, the events at the Capitol on January 6th, just 3 weeks ago, were outrageous. Watching the ease with which many of the rioters shattered windows and scaled the walls of federal property without confrontation or shots fired. How in some cases, rioters were chatting casually and taking selfies with police and were actually ushered inside the chambers. And yes, how some even attacked the police, whose blue lives suddenly didn't seem to matter as much to some of them anymore, was indeed appalling and horrifying. But even 3 weeks later, much of the media is still failing to show the gravity of what could have been. The images, limited though they might be, of those rioters wearing full combat gear who silently, stealthily got on with business, who were seen conducting themselves with military precision, wearing earpieces, communicating with each other, who held in their hands zip ties, possibly with the intent to kidnap or to do other harm to our lawmakers in order to allow Donald Trump to remain in office despite his clear electoral loss. Rather, we are shown repeatedly scenes with the man in the silly-looking costume, people casually strolling through the Capitol as if they own the place. In fact, many of them, supremely confident that the Capitol in fact does belong to them, said those exact words on the video, believing there would be no repercussions for what they deemed patriotic acts. Gleefully filmed themselves live and posted videos of their illegal acts. When the violent rioters finally left, in some cases provided a helping hand and escorted politely down the stairs by the police, many in the same violent mob walked peacefully to a nearby hotel and drank and celebrated. There were very few arrests. Despite weeks, even months of warnings about the rise of white nationalist extremism and the potential for violence on January 6th in particular, the FBI was forced to ask for the public's help in identifying many of the rioters from the photos taken that day. Meanwhile, US foreign policy and national security professionals have been worried about the reputation and standing of the US and its authority in promoting democracy and freedom abroad after the entire world witnessed what only we Americans seem unwilling to see. This is, in fact, who we are. 244 years ago, when delegates from the 13 colonies formed the United States and declared America an independent nation from Great Britain, the colonists outlined in their Declaration of Independence a tenet that has become one of the most poignant and most recognizable statements in the American lexicon. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Most of us fail to look beyond these noble and aspirational words. For those who do, they understand that the colonists omitted a good portion of the truth and history from their great declaration. We've been reeling from it ever since, both at home and abroad, in our domestic policy and in our foreign policy. The truth that America is a nation built on stolen land by stolen people. In fact, where the University of Michigan sits is the land of native territories, of native peoples. Violence, including electoral and racial violence, seems to be hardwired in our DNA. Consistently, both our domestic and foreign policy and actions, these American ideals straddle the divide between a certain aspirational, perhaps even moral clarity set by the founding fathers and a strategic incoherence in implementing these so-called truths. The US has long promoted democracy abroad. Many would argue that this public promotion of democracy helped legitimate the US's global leadership during the Cold War. But while we began by championing democracy and human rights abroad, we have hidden our military and CIA interventions to suit our own desires, propped up dictators and overthrown democratic regimes, and even denied human rights to segments of our own population at home. This dichotomy might not have been clear at home, It has not been lost on many newly independent nations looking to chart their own path towards independence and freedom from colonialism. According to Professor Benjamin R. Young of Dakota State University, during the Cold War era, the concept of third world originated as a term of empowerment and inspiration for millions of people living in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, who sought an alternative system to Soviet-style socialism or US liberal capitalism. French demographer Alfred Sauvy coined the term in 1952, but it was the Martinique-born political philosopher Frantz Fanon who developed the concept into a full-fledged theory of democracy. A full-fledged theory of decolonization. In his famous 1961 book, The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon argued, Europe is literally the creation of the third world. The wealth which smothers her is that which was stolen from the underdeveloped peoples. Young claims that the idea of third worldism was meant to unify people all over the world fighting colonialism and imperialism. He says that from the Black Panther Party fighting racism in US cities to African liberation movements overthrowing European colonial regimes, the third world was a global project of emancipation and solidarity. As he iterates, the wretched of the earth inspired revolutionaries and radicals all over the decolonizing world. Influenced by the horrors of the Vietnam War, US militarism abroad, governments as diverse as those in Algeria, China, Cuba, even North Korea claimed to be the sole torchbearer of a unified third world anti-imperialist front in the 1960s and 1970s. Influenced by Fanon's work, he says that third world leaders and figures promoted the ideas of national sovereignty and self-reliance, hoping to cultivate a third way of development. And while the US may have championed initially these newly independent states' sovereignty and self-reliance, when these nations chose not only their own path, but a third way, the US stopped listening to their voices and their desires. It was easier to believe there should be only a binary choice between communism and Western-style free markets and democracy. But we as a nation are more than only one thing. When our actions at home and our interventions abroad failed to live up to the aspirations of the founding fathers, people began asking why in ever louder voices. June 6th, 1946, the president of the National Negro Congress transmitted a, quote, petition to the United Nations on behalf of 13 million oppressed Negro citizens of the United States of America, calling upon the United Nations to mobilize the influence of all organized mankind toward fulfillment here in the United States of the stated purpose of the United Nations, to promote and encourage respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without discrimination, without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion, end quote. Simultaneously, National Negro Congress, or the NNC, wrote a letter to President Truman explaining its rationale for turning to the UN, stating, I quote, "This is an historic moment in the life of the nation. Vast internal economic and social upheavals confront us. Added to these, traditional pre-war policy of racial oppression carried out by powerful forces in this country is now being inhumanly reflected more than ever before. Negro people had hoped out of the war there would come an extension of democratic rights and liberties so heroically fought for by all oppressed peoples. Your administration, however, has reversed the democratic program of the Roosevelt government, both internally and in relation to foreign policy. Great burdens have been forced upon the shoulders of the Negro people. Negro citizens find the present conditions intolerable and are therefore presenting their appeal to the highest court of mankind, the United Nations. The National Negro Congress in convention assembled feels impelled to send you the information which motivates this historic petition, end quote. In the petition, the NNC spells out the jurisdiction of the United Nations from the UN Charter and Regressing in particular. Document in detail numerous ways that Negro peoples were being discriminated against in the aftermath of World War II. Arrests and detention, housing, education, work, health, pay, and much more. NNC concludes its letter to President Truman with the following, and I think it's really resonant to what we're facing today. And I quote, "The cancer of racism has spread its poison throughout the life of America. Its throttling and killing effect upon the people of the entire nation, North and South, Negro and white, grows more fearful and more anachronistic with the passing of each hour. The Negro people, for themselves and for the benefit of all other inhabitants of America, demand full freedom and absolute equality. Nothing short of this will satisfy them. Where one is enslaved, all are in chains." Fast forward a few years from 1946, December 17th of 1951. You'll imagine that this is because nothing was done. On that date, Paul Robeson and William Patterson from the Civil Rights Congress submitted a petition to the UN General Assembly to the United Nations titled, "We Charge Genocide, the Crime of the United States Government Against the Negro People." They made their case with a detailed legal argument and analysis under the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in a book-length petition that documented hundreds of lynching cases and other forms of brutality and discrimination, evincing a pattern of government inaction and complicity. Needless to say, some of you may not have known about these petitions to the United Nations. I know that I myself only recently learned of them in preparation for my classes this year. But unfortunately, with the Cold War raging, the US government maneuvered to prevent the United Nations from formally debating or even considering the charges brought in this last petition. According to the Black American historian Carol Anderson, in her book, Eyes Off the Prize, The United Nations and the African American Struggle for Human Rights from 1944 to 1951, she says that working behind the scenes, US officials were even able to prevent any discussion of the petition by the UN Commission on Human Rights. Many of these Black activists were denied the right to travel abroad and speak about racism at home after submitting this petition, and many were monitored by the FBI and had their reputations tarnished. In the 1950s and 1960s, though other figures were rising to the challenges as well. As America fought a war in Vietnam, ostensibly to advance freedom there, here at home, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., whom we honor today, declared, "All we say to America is, be true to what you said on paper." We hail Martin Luther King Jr. today, but that is because we do not remember our history. In the 1960s, he was one of the most despised men in America for daring to challenge the system of oppression, for demanding equal justice, for demanding rights, for calling out the war in Vietnam and the status quo. We must not forget that. As we know, from the summer and fall, clearly Black Americans still have not realized full equality or humanity we have long sought, but we have not stood still either. This demand to be coherent in our actions to promote democracy and freedom at home and abroad remains a profound American challenge. As a diplomat, my colleagues and I fought tirelessly to promote and protect human rights, advance democracy, good governance, accountability, and fair electoral processes. As a lawyer, I advise leaders abroad to follow their own constitution and to respect their own laws. But as a Black American woman, I also interjected a reality that many of my other colleagues either did not do or could not speak to as articulately because they had not suffered in the same way. I admitted that the United States is not a perfect union, that we are constantly striving to make it ever so. So I will repeat part of what I said in my 4th of July speech in 2013 when I was the US ambassador to South Sudan, then and now the world's newest country. So it's weird to quote myself from 2013. Here it is. I stand before you today as a Black American female ambassador, appointed by America's first African American president. But this moment was more than 50 years in the making, 150 years following emancipation and 237 years after our independence. It is true that sometimes progress can be slow, but this moment, right here, right now, with me standing before you, a person whose ancestors were not considered equal to white landowning men, whose mothers and sisters, as women, also could not vote, were also not considered equal by that great Declaration of Independence, demonstrates that even slow progress is better than standing still. End quote. And in President Obama's own 2013 message on the 4th of July, which I also read aloud at the US Embassy in Juba, he wrote, 237 years later, their words are just as bold and revolutionary as they were when they were first inscribed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But his remarks continued, and he said, but while these truths may be self-evident, history tells us they have never been self-executing. For more than 2 centuries, our nation has been on an enduring journey to bridge the meaning of our founders' words with the realities of our time. I think those remarks are really special because they remind us of the work that we all have to do. In his historic I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial during the Great March on Washington, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment, end quote. So how do we address the urgency of this moment? Diplomats and foreign policy leaders and everyday citizens must raise their voices at home and continue to keep them loud abroad in recognition of the inextricable linkages between the two. But we have to match our aspirations and actions at home with the intensity and urgency of those calling for justice and accountability for those who have been killed, including George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and countless others. All of us need to engage our local communities at home and abroad. Local communities can speak to the ties between US foreign policy and the persistence of racism in the United States and the impact on their own lives. In conclusion, if ever there was an urgent moment, it is also now. Americans must be more humble. We must heed our own advice that we give to other nations about democratic norms and principles. What we believe about who we are as a nation, our values, and our common story, it matters. The question of the identity that binds a nation together matters even more in a democracy of diverse ancestry, religion, ideology, and relationships to the land. While Americans have a shared history, it is not widely known. We lack a common story about that history. As numerous people have written, are we an exceptional country that pioneered a radical experiment in democratic self-government? Are we a refuge for the tired, the poor, downtrodden of the world, who in this country can find freedom and opportunity? Are we a country that denied freedom to minorities so that they could help build prosperity for others at their own expense? The story of America is, in fact, all of these narratives and more, both the redemptive and the damning. But we must learn our history and we must teach it to each other and to future generations. We must redefine who we are and reckon with the true national narrative of all of our past. We must rediscover the story of immigrants in this country. We must learn about what we did to the Native Americans. We must learn about those who came here from every continent seeking the promise of a better life, whose contributions to this country are another critical part of our nation's identity. But we mustn't forget those who have suffered and struggled and who remain oppressed right now here at home. Finally, I would just like to say a final note that today is also Holocaust Remembrance Day. And it's important to remember some of the petitions that have been filed that called upon the Genocide Convention. We know that the Nuremberg trials resulted from World War II and the atrocities and genocide committed in the Holocaust. And we know and must remember that words matter. So I will close there, and I have a lot of time to take your questions and comments, and I thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Page. That was a really powerful and moving presentation. And so in many ways, I sort of want to stop and just think about what you said, but I am going to ask an initial question to start us off. And I will also note that as I'm asking my question, I actually misspoke at the beginning. So if you in the audience want to ask questions, please submit your questions through the Q&A function, not the chat function on Zoom. And please also, when you do, identify your name and affiliation so we have a sense of the source of the question as we ask them. So, Ambassador, I thought that was, as I said, a really powerful lecture. And I guess I'm wondering, just to start us off, if you could speak a little bit more about your views about how our current, let's say, domestic crisis, and I think what many perceive as regression on our efforts to achieve like the promises in our founding documents, how that affects our, or should affect our foreign policy. You said a little bit that we should be more humble. And what does that actually mean? Should we maybe, stop speaking as often about democracy and good governance and rule of law values as we sort of look internally and try to understand better how we understand those values? And then once we have a better grasp of it ourselves, maybe go back on the world stage and promote them? Or do we do something closer to what you did as ambassador for South Sudan, which is sort of recognize our limits, but still underscore that these are our aspirations, even if they don't always seem to be in full view in our political conversations at home? So sort of how do we think about that question?
I think it's actually a combination of recognizing, first of all, our own struggle. And that's why I highlighted the fact that we don't actually share a common history. As we have seen with the rise of various platforms where people can say whatever they think, where truth is no longer taken as truth, where the term alternative facts could be created. I mean, you can't have alternative facts, but we have never reckoned with our past, brutal as it is. We're not taught it in school. I mean, most of this I learned either from my peers who were much more knowledgeable about the Black struggle, the Black liberation struggle, or I learned through my own research or work as I started learning more about the UN and the classes that I was going to be teaching, both at the law school and the Ford School, and the racist origins. So I do think that one of the things that we need to do is at least start from some sort of common ground. You know, we often hear people saying, oh, but I can't be blamed. This was hundreds of years ago. Get over it. But here we have just had an insurrection at the Capitol, and those same people who, I mean, obviously I'm generalizing, but some of those same people who called peaceful protesters wanting full human rights and accountability and justice are now suddenly saying, let's move on. We just need to have unity. No, it can't work that way. But as long as we don't even have a starting point, it is difficult to do. But I think we have to continue. I mean, research will continue to be conducted, and hopefully some of those research outcomes and studies will infiltrate policy, both foreign policy, public policy, and domestic policy, in how we can get to a better point. Why are we still celebrating Columbus Day around the world, in the United States? I know that some states have taken to doing other things and calling it other things. Why don't we know about the destruction of Black Wall Street, all of the different race riots that were begun because people didn't want to share power with Black people? And so we regressed. We now have Raphael Warnock as the first Black senator from the state of Georgia in the year 2021. So we have to keep speaking about these things, and we have to get over the sense that we can't apologize. We should acknowledge and apologize for the wrongs. It doesn't mean that I personally did something, but we have to acknowledge that it occurred, it happened, and it's hardwired and baked into our system. So yes, I think we should continue to speak about it, but we should also be forthright, especially, and this is why diversity is so important in all of these arenas, not just foreign policy, of course, but if people don't know and have never had to struggle, it's very difficult to empathize with people who have very similar aspirations but have been oppressed. So yes, I think we need to continue.
And so great. That's actually a great launching off point for a number of questions that I see in the Q&A. And that's about, so you spoke about, we can't just ignore our past. We can't just have unity in the absence of some kind of self-reckoning and acknowledgement of who we are as a country. And so what might a process of reconciliation look like? And you also sort of gestured in this direction. So might the United States benefit from looking at other countries that have had their own truth and reconciliation processes and tried to grapple with their own very oppressive and difficult pasts? And is that even something that we can imagine happening in the United States? How do we get there?
I would say that it is very difficult. I have a hard time believing that it could happen anytime soon in the United States, given how polarized we are. In many of the countries, we notably talk about South Africa, but there have been many countries that have had some sort of a Truth and Justice Commission or Reconciliation Commission around the world, Latin America, as well as Africa, et cetera. But generally speaking, people have been somewhat united on the idea that there needed to be some sort of a reckoning. And they struggled with what kind of a format the process should take. So even in South Africa, we don't always recall that they had to allow for people not to be criminally punished as long as they agreed to tell the truth and come forward with all of the evidence of the crimes that they committed. So, I don't want to be overly legalistic. There's always a problem with amnesty and whatnot, but there can be processes like that, but it is hard to honestly think that it could happen. That said, at local levels, it can happen, and it is occurring in some places. In Chicago, there are communities that are actually doing reparations for police violence against people in certain communities, agreed upon with the community, legalized, and it's reparations. There are many forms that reparations take. And we often think, oh, well, we can't possibly give reparations to the ancestors of enslaved people. How are we going to know who they are? How are we going to find them? But reparations have been done in many circumstances for other oppressed people, even right here in the United States. So again, if we don't know our history, we fail to make some of the arguments that could be utilized. So while we might not be able to take that path at a national level right now, I think that it is important in the communities that it can happen. They're doing it. They are moving forward. They're not waiting. And I think that's a great thing because most things are local.
Yeah, that reminds me of, however much regression we've had in the past couple of years, the fact that the state of Mississippi has itself changed the flag. I mean, that seems like a striking step forward, even in the face of some steps back.
Exactly.
And it's done locally, yeah. Okay, we have a question. Our next question comes from Cecilia Pelosniemi. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name, from UN Women. And this is a question more about your personal experiences as a diplomat. And the question is that you mentioned that you were able to connect better with the leadership of countries where you were posted as a diplomat than some of your colleagues who couldn't speak to, the Black experience in the United States. Did you yourself, though, face racism during your time in the U.S. Foreign Service or as a UN official? And how did you deal with it when you did? And this is, I think, a great question actually for many of our students who I think struggle with the question of to what extent and how they grapple with these kinds of issues in their professional lives or in their student lives.
Yeah, I think I was very lucky in some ways because I think everyone's experience is different. I believe, I guess I would say that I think in many ways I've always been very independent, and I've been really quite a trailblazer, but only because other people blazed that trail before me. Mm-hmm. And that includes, my parents, and obviously some of these icons that we're talking about. And of course, much less famous people like my high school English teacher who encouraged me and encouraged my love of reading and writing, and put me on the editorial board of our literary magazine in high school. And my parents were very much, they really did not want me to join the State Department. They thought this was a horrible idea. It was the equivalent of going to work for the post office, which for non-Black people or some others, they might not understand this, but for educated Blacks, especially in the South, college educated, often the best job they could get was a good government job working at the post office. And so even though it was the State Department and the Office of the Legal Advisor, which only takes, this select group of people from the top 10 law schools, for them, this was, wait, why did you go to Harvard Law School and then go work for the government? You should be making money. But ultimately, they supported it in the end, mostly because I'd already accepted the position, and they couldn't do anything about it. And then they loved coming to visit me and, seeing where I was working in all these different countries. But I would say that for the most part, in Africa, and even at the UN overseas, I did not have any issues. And I think a large part of it is because, especially while working for the US government, we are the face, not just as the ambassador, but as diplomats. We are the face of the United States government. And while we've taken a beating in recent years, the power of the US flag and what it stands for, the reputation, even if we don't live up to all of our aspirations, is incredibly powerful. And so I always had access, or my supervisors when I was more junior, and people appreciated the fact that I am a woman of color, and that they chose me to be in their country. They were proud of the fact that a woman who looked like me could, in fact, be a senior diplomat, mostly for the US, but also at the UN. Slightly different with the UN depending on where you serve, but so I didn't have that issue in the country by and large. But one of the things that is important to remember, and a friend of mine from Nepal actually told me this a couple of years ago, that one of the things that his family noted was, well, we don't ever have anyone other than white ambassadors serving in Nepal. So I guess they're the only ones who were interested in the diplomatic service, or other people are not, educated enough or credible, or, and that we don't often stop to think about how people are seeing us when they only see a slice of what the United States represents. So although we're thinking about it from our perspective, diversity is positive, diversity in all aspects of life, but it's also important for other nations to see us represented and to see the diverse wealth of people that we have in the country.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great. And so, great. The next question, thank you. The next question I have is from Abdul Ansari, who is a PhD student in the philosophy department here. And he asks, could you say a little on the particular ways that Black activists, writers, and scholars might shape the agenda on US foreign policy? And actually, I'm going to tie that to another question that was asked by Andrea Tillotson, who is a recent alumna of the university, who asks about a particular dimension of US foreign policy, and particularly about how maybe the current moment, or maybe Black activists in particular, might contribute to changing how the United States engages with the human rights system on the international plane.
So a couple of thoughts. I've never been an activist. I have done my activism in a way through trying to lead the kind of life that I believe everyone should be entitled to, and ethically and morally. But I do see something that is really positive that has come out of this moment, both the protests and demonstrations, as well as the Capitol riot. I'm hearing and reading about a lot of voices that I did not hear and see before. So I do see this as very, very positive, because we are now, and granted, there are always going to be people who have nothing, it's not a racism thing. They're just not interested. That's fine. But, when I started looking at the comments that were made and the scenarios that were playing out, both during the protests and my own feelings, I mean, it was a really rough spring and summer and fall. We watched institutions and organizations and powerful people, sports clubs, who just could not and would not accept that people had the right to peacefully protest a violation of their human rights, or just simply a recognition of Black humanity. And some of that is because it's threatening to them. And I'm not even talking about the whole white supremacy issue, which is another dimension, but just simply, why is it that these far right, mostly white rioters, not protesters. I mean, they were protesters before they crossed that line. But once they became violent, they were now rioters. They vandalized, they looted, they broke windows, scaled walls. And the ease with which they could do that, the whole world saw all of these peaceful protests throughout the summer calling for something that is not very difficult. Just recognize that I'm a human being. And the way that the contrast between the way that these other people could do what they did and shouldn't even be punished, could walk out, one shot fired. I mean, which I'm glad. I don't mean to give the notion that I wish that people had been heard. No, but we can clearly see that the standard is different. So I think that the more that these voices are coming out, and the more that they are in mainstream media, in Foreign Policy magazine, in Harper's, in Foreign Affairs magazine, in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and then of course, other journals. But it was largely Black people and Indigenous people who said, we weren't surprised, and stop saying this is not who we are. It's okay to say it's not all that we are, but it is part of who we are. And so I think that the more that these voices are listened to, I mean, the Twitter feed, and I mean, even I'm being sucked into it because the comments and the writing is so interesting. So yes, I do think that this is a moment where the activists are getting their words out, people are being heard, and it's making a difference. And so I think the more that they can continue to influence, even at the local community level, which can then be taken up to the higher levels, I think that's really, really critical and very important. And I do think that that is what is happening at this moment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And since that's where you ended, I'm going to ask a question that picks up on it by Ella McKenzie, who is a first-year student at the university, and says, like, well, this is sort of a broad question, but still she wants to ask it. And the question is, okay, so what concrete, she puts in quotes, in addition to, but I'm just going to note also that so many people in the Q&A are saying, thank you, thank you, thank you. So that's embedded in this whole conversation. But she asks, thank you. She says, thank you. And then she says, what concrete next steps do you recommend we take as a country on the federal and policy level to address these disparities, inequities that you just described? And is there something like, what would you recommend, for example, that the Biden administration do in response to what happened at the Capitol and the severe disproportionate treatment of those rioters versus the protesters this summer and spring for the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, a number of things. One, I do believe that he has already taken steps that are fundamentally different from what many of his predecessors have done. One, he acknowledged it right away and said, if this had been Black Lives Matter's protesters, the treatment would have been fundamentally different. We have not had a president say something that clearly. So while his voice may not have been heard by some of the ones who need to hear it the most, it was heard by many of us, and that's important. And again, I mean, just as Trump used his words in a profoundly negative way, Biden is using his words in a very positive way. So he's also taken concrete steps just by naming a cabinet that is very diverse. And people used to ask me, they don't say this quite as much anymore, but people used to always say on recruitment committees, oh, but we want a diverse staff, whatever the organization. But we're talking about qualified minorities. Well, qualified women. They never say that when it's a white man. They don't say, well, yes, we are looking to hire anyone who's qualified, including white men. The assumption is they're qualified. The rest of us have to prove it. But these are people with actual true track records that proves that they are capable. We might not all agree on the policies that they either have put forward before or implemented or will put forward in the future, but just simply having a diverse range of opinions, ideas, because we all start from where we are, from who we are. That is our first, most fundamental basis for how we interact in the world. So those are two things that are already positive. And then I think by having these voices around him, he has proven to be a listener. It doesn't mean that he is necessarily going to agree with all that is recommended to him, but he does listen, and he is humble, and he is empathetic. I think all of those are very positive going forward. He's already taken one executive order just simply abolishing new contracts for privately run prisons that are contracted by the Justice Department. That's huge. At state levels, Illinois, I believe, is on track to become the first statewide, so not just countywide, but statewide, to abolish the paid bail system, the fee bail system. I know Washtenaw County in Ann Arbor is on that path, and they are also looking at that at a more national level. So these are very concrete steps that can be taken to try to dismantle some of the systems that have been in place. This is where also research does really come in handy. And you know, I often go back to just a few years ago. Colin Kaepernick kneeling was, you know, quietly, respectfully. He even took the time to ask former military veterans of various ethnicities, what do you recommend? Because initially he was sitting, and they said, no, it's better to kneel. If you take a kneel, if you kneel, that is respected in sports, and it's respected by our military. And yet that was outrageously protested. Oh my goodness, never, we can't have this. But today we have moved forward. Unfortunately, that moment passed him, but he helped to start the process that now the moment was right, and we are doing things. So, you know, I like I said at the beginning, jokingly, sounding like an airline hostess, but there are tons of webinars now, and there is so much more of a willingness and openness to talk about these ideas and talk about systemic racism, or to talk about these aren't just one bad apple cops. So I think that alone is positive, and because of that, consequential changes are being made.
Okay, we're sort of toggling between domestic and foreign policy here. So I'm going to go now back into the foreign policy domain and ask a question. And of course, like I think part of the point of your talk is that they're very interrelated. So this seems in keeping with the spirit of the talk. David Greco, who's a medical student here, asks, and this is a question that in fact ties together the domestic and the foreign, whether you see the often brutal police response to peaceful protests and journalists throughout 2020 as not just impacting US foreign policy, but in some ways emboldening other countries to engage in similar crackdowns and peaceful protests or political speech. And so I guess the broader question would be, to what extent our domestic practices in the realm of human rights have ripple effects throughout the world and are create copycat actions, basically?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I'm not sure that they are copying us or we're copying them, but there's no shortage of abuses by police around the world. So I think that sometimes we get stuck with how influential we think that we might be. But where we can be, and where we have been influential, and not in a positive way, is exporting our militaristic policing overseas. And that includes in the equipment that is sold around the world by American companies, but also other foreign governments, to us, as well as us to other nations, often since I talked about the third world, maybe that's not the right term anymore, but to other countries, and sending rubber bullets and all of these, what were they called? The not spitballs, but but all of these kind of militaristic actions, even something as simple as calling our police a police service, which a lot of other countries have started to do. Doesn't always mean that they then start operating as a service-oriented agency rather than a force. But if you can start changing the culture, but we have to do that here at home. And, we have to stop having police forces buying excess military equipment as if, we are living in war zones all over the United States all the time. And finally, I would say that the one other thing that is almost always occurs is that when people protest police violence, the police are often the most violent towards those protesters, even when they're peaceful.
Mhm.
But we, again, so it goes back to how we also sell our values. If those aren't the values that we live by, as has been evidenced, a lot of people around the world weren't shocked.
Yeah.
This is what we do right here at home. And yes, it's true that the insurrection or the mob, the riot at the Capitol was bad, but there have been plenty of other peaceful protests, protesting against other things, labor laws, things like that, where the police have been very brutal, and because they're maintaining the status quo.
Mhm, mhm. I think a lot of Americans don't realize the extent to which our military policy affects what happens at home. That it's a two-way street.
Yeah.
And the thing that struck me, actually, since this is part of your talk about the inauguration and the response to the Capitol riot, was the fact that the government started referring to the seat of government as a secure green zone and the rest of DC as the red zone, which is straight out of the language from the Iraq occupation.
Exactly.
Okay, I have a question now about basically the U.S. failure to recognize that it has its own idiosyncrasies and problems. And it's a question from Jill Mansky, who is an alum and instructor at the School of Education. And she'd be interested in hearing your views on basically, this is also relates actually to the earlier question about human rights, about the US discourse on exceptionalism and the way in which many mainstream reactions referred to use language, as you said, banana republic, to refer to the insurrection or talk about third world countries and other ways of sort of othering what happens in other countries as if we don't experience those problems at home. So the question, I guess, is what you make of basically that discourse of US exceptionalism and how we might tackle it.
Interestingly enough, I had to teach just before going on to the class, but to this lecture. But and so I missed a Council on Foreign Relations webinar on exactly this question, American exceptionalism. So I wish I could make some very pithy comment, but again, I think it goes back to understanding our history. And it doesn't mean that we have to suddenly say, well, we're not exceptional, but we have to recognize that exceptionalism to whom and for whom. And so, Indigenous people don't feel like, the colonists, were exceptional, except exceptionally horrible. They could have made a decision to end slavery at the time that they founded the nation on other people's lands, but they didn't. They made a conscious decision to do that. It doesn't mean that everyone is bad. We live in times that change. I, of course, wish that they had made that decision instead. I wish that, many, many things were different, but that's not what we had. But if we never recognize that there were choices that were made, the Missouri Compromise, Reconstruction, ending Reconstruction and putting back in place slavery by every other method except the actual physical chains. You know, so again, I think we have to be honest. We have to learn more about our history. And that a lot of that starts also with the curriculum. We don't teach civics anymore, if we ever did. And history, the history that, I'll just speak for myself, since I'm long out of high school and undergrad, but the history that we teach is European history. There's usually a part that's Greek civilization and ancient Rome, but it's not our own ancient history. And when it is, it's we have one day of, we're going to talk about slavery today. We're going to have one day where we honor Martin Luther King Jr. and we always talk about all of the, we've forgotten that he was hated, he was despised, he was, and he was assassinated. When people say, well, they should do these things peacefully. You didn't like Colin Kaepernick either. There's never a right time. So all of these things are woven into our history and our past, but will never be exceptional to everyone. And especially if we don't recognize where we have made choices that didn't benefit everyone, despite, this lofty language.
Okay, thank you. And so now I'm going to ask, I think, a series of questions about basically your time as a diplomat again. And so the first comes from Jennifer Kim, who's a sophomore in LSNA. And she asks whether in your time abroad you saw white privilege as prevalent or as prevalent an issue or priority in other nations as it is in the US. And the question of how this issue ought to be brought up and approached in international circles.
Well, I saw it to a certain degree, but I will be honest and say I have almost all of my life wanted to live overseas. And it wasn't until much, much later in life, after having lived overseas for several years at this point, that I kind of put it together, the reason that I felt more comfortable in foreign lands. It was because I realized that I don't feel like I belong, like I'm treated as if I belong in the country of my own birth. Whereas when I'm overseas, I'm taken for who I am. People sometimes will question because they're interested. Oh, who in your family is white, or are you Latina, or are you, these different things. We don't have those conversations in the United States because, even when I read my statement about Barack Obama being the first Black president, he is biracial. I'm not naive. I know exactly how America considers him. He's a Black man. And he's certainly a Black man when he's trying to hail a taxi, as he said when he was running for election the first time. But why do we insist on denying people who have other ethnicities the right to their full personality? So, and it's because of slavery, because of the one-drop rule that other countries didn't have. It's not to say that they didn't have their own virulent strains of racism and other isms, they do, but that wasn't part of it. So people can be proud to be originally from Barbados or originally from, wherever, and be mixed race with whatever their mix is. But a Barack Obama couldn't, a Tiger Woods couldn't. But I will say that I'm happy to say that Kamala Harris gets to get that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that represents progress, but or if it's because she's not a man and Black men are threatening, whereas Black women are, angry Black women. So we have to be careful about that. But they are not seen as quite as threatening as, as this big, powerful Black man. And so she is able to be the first, Black and South Asian vice president, female vice president, whereas, everyone else before couldn't.
Yeah.
Now, in fairness, that could also be because her father is originally Jamaican and not, from the African continent, but how did he get to Jamaica? So we have this, so I think that it is, my friends, certainly my foreign friends, whether they're African or European, I mean, they're just mortified to watch all of this, and they don't want to live here because of the way that we have not dealt with race. And so I see this as an opening, and quite honestly, I'm just, trying my best to open that door as wide as possible, because I think this is the time. If we can't do it now, it's going to be a long time before we ever can. So I would just say, push the limits, and, again, you be respectful, be kind, but ask the questions. And I think that's important. So I don't want to say that like I said, I don't want to say that there was no racism or white privilege. You certainly see it in white communities in Africa. So, there's even a name for them in Kenya, the Kenya Cowboys.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it definitely exists. And there's even a hierarchy, just like there is, honestly, in the United States with race, and in lots of other countries, where the fairer skinned you are from whatever community you come from, slightly higher on the pecking order you are.
Okay.
So that definitely pertains in many of the countries that I've been in as well, even if it wasn't only white.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. And so I'm just going to insert myself back into the queue because, I think what you describe is the case. Even you mentioned earlier, we need to pay more attention to the lives of immigrant communities and whatnot. I think for a lot of my life, I'm the child of immigrants. It was the case that I preferred not to acknowledge in any way my immigrant background or my difference, right? Because I'm sufficiently ethnically ambiguous. People didn't always know. I think that is changing. But do you think so this is my question to you. Do you think would you prefer an American society in which we more openly ask questions upon meeting people? Like, where are your parents from? Are you half white? Are you Latinx? Are you, or would you prefer that those questions not be, as I think for a long time they were not, and I think many would still say they should not be, like the kind of thing that people ask, because there's a certain othering to the question itself and a worry about offending the recipient in some way to ask those kinds of questions?
I would say for me personally, it would be odd. Hi, your name is Susan Page. What race are you? Yeah, that would be weird, because
right.
Well, I don't even know you. Well, why are you talking to me? You've just come up to me in a restaurant. I mean, you know what? But I think because it's always been silenced, it's the negative that, well, if I don't say it, then, it doesn't make me seem racist, but I mean, unless you are ambivalent, I wonder if that person is, whatever. I know that Black people look at people all the time like that. I mean, obviously I'm only me, so I don't know how other people look at people, but it's the first thing we see, right? And so I think if we can be allowed to have all of our humanity, whether it's that, why can't we be proud of that? And at the same time, when we talk about color blindness, we're not colorblind. I mean, you're looking at me. So like, and when somebody, people don't do it so much now because of course now people just stay quiet, but when they would say, you know, oh, but I don't think of you as being Black, that's not a compliment.
I know.
You know,
I know.
because what they're signaling is, well, when I think of Black people, I think of, and then you can fill in the blank. And so therefore I don't see you that way. But I'm not ashamed of that. And even if I am, I can't change it. It is who I am, and it's a part and parcel of who I am. So I think that if we can be more open about it and talk more about it, but again, this whole, oh my gosh, you know, but it wasn't my ancestors who enslaved people, or you get the comment that, well, Africans enslaved, you know, sold Africans into slavery too. Yes, you know, as did Arabs, as did lots of other people. I mean, but we're talking about, by and large, the vast majority, you know, and so all of these kind of false equivalencies, to me, fall by the wayside.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to get back now to our conversation about, thank you, about your time as a diplomat. And actually, we're sort of nearing the end. So I'm just going to ask the question this way. I'm sure that there are lots of students on the webinar now, or will watch it in the future, who think about careers in foreign service and in diplomacy. And so if you were to give them tips now about what they should think about, and you know, some of the pros and cons, and just how to think through the process of whether they should pursue a career, try to pursue a career like the one that you've had, what would you suggest? What would you advise them?
I always say, if you have a desire to do it, go for it. You know, if you're still a student, study what you want to study, get as much knowledge of the things that interest you, so that you can be well-rounded. I do think it's important, as we, you know, develop more and more tools, that people become, I don't mean just normal tech savvy, which I'm certainly not, but with the technology and the tools that are out there, that are changing the direction and the nature of all industries, you know, whether it's AI or voice recognition, or you know, how are people connecting on all of these platforms when they are hearing impaired or challenged or visually impaired. It doesn't help them if they can't read, you know, the subtitles. So you know, I think all of these kinds of issues, learn statistics, learn accounting, again, not that you need to go into that field, but so that you have an understanding of some of these different areas. And, you know, if you're passionate about it, I mean, I loved my career. I mean, loved it. And not only being, you know, the ambassador, I loved getting out and talking to the population, the people. And what I hated was sitting behind the desk writing these required reports, including the Human Rights Report and all of the other mandated reports. I loved going out into these far-flung villages and, you know, practicing my language skills, or trying to learn at least a few words in a variety of different dialects in the country. I personally like learning about cultural touchstones. So I'm really intrigued by the intersection of anthropology, sociology, political science, and how that matters in terms of the development of humans. And I'm fascinated by rituals, whether it's wedding rituals and routines, the colors, or even funeral rites. Why does this society or this ethnic group grieve in a certain way, or believe it needs to be X number of days? I mean, I think all of that is so interesting. So if you have a curiosity and a real desire to learn about other peoples, I would say, I mean, it has been the greatest really honor of my life to work for the US government and be in public service and be paid to do what I love doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Susan. Before we wrap it up and I say thank you to you, I have been asked to just make a couple announcements on behalf of the Donia Center, which is first to just mention that on Wednesday, February 17th, from 4 to 5:30, again, Eastern Standard Time, there will be a talk on, and the title is U.S. Policy in the Middle East, Human Rights and/or National Interests. And it will feature Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer, Daniel Abraham, and the professor of Middle East Policy Studies at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton, and and a former U.S. ambassador to Egypt and Israel. So you can, I sort of jumbled that up, but you get the basic tenor of it, and you can visit the Donia Center's website for more information and the Zoom link. And then just the second thing to mention is that the center is also with the Department of Epidemiology and the School of Public Health and the Ford School, hosting a semester-long human rights film series on enforced disappearances. And so you should also go, I encourage you also to go to the website to learn more about that film series. The first screening is focused on Argentina and will be tomorrow. So with those announcements out of the way, I will just say, Ambassador, it's been so wonderful being able to have this conversation with you. I really feel privileged to have been asked to host and moderate this. I think that our listeners can see how lucky I am to have you as a new colleague. So although I know you had a wonderful career in government, I hope you're also finding that your new career in our little neck of the woods in Michigan is also fulfilling. And thank you so much for this really illuminating and wonderful lecture and conversation. And obviously these are themes that we need to continue to have as a society, and that I hope to continue to have with you personally. So I will clap on behalf of all of our listeners
Thank you all so much. Thank you very much. If I could leave you all with one word, I would say listen, study, inform yourself, and really try hard to dig into the listening, because when have you ever heard someone saying, that one listens too much? Yeah. So thank you all very much. It's been my pleasure, and I'm delighted to be back at University of Michigan. Go Blue!
Go Blue!